Medusa's Blind Stone. Untold Stories. By Natalie Haynes. For my brothers who were with me from the very beginning, and for my sisters whom I found along the way. Part 1. Sisters. Child, we have seen you. We have seen all those whom men call monsters. And we have seen them as men call them. Of course, they call themselves heroes. We see them only for a moment. Then they disappear. But that is enough. Enough to know that a hero is not always kind, or brave, or loyal. Sometimes, not all the time. But sometimes, he is a monster. And the monster? Who is she? She is what happens when someone cannot be saved. This particular monster was attacked, abused, slandered, and yet, in the usual stories, she is the one we are supposed to fear. She is the monster. And so, let us look far, far away, towards the setting sun, as far as one can possibly go. There is a sea where the land curls and winds, penetrating the earth through a narrow, winding crevice. You are in Ethiopia, bordering on Oceanus, the edge of the world, the edge of the sea. If you could fly high above, like a bird, you would see this channel winding like a poisonous snake. You have flown over the heads of the Riphean mountains, though perhaps you did not notice them, for they usually stay hidden in their caves, lest they fall from the jagged cliffs and plunge into the swirling sea. Did they survive such a fall? Of course. They are gods. But even a god does not wish to be crushed between the waves and the rocks for all eternity. You have also passed the home of the Gorgon sisters, not far from the Riphean mountains. Their sisters, as we call them, though they have never met. They are bound together, though they do not know it, or have long forgotten, across the air and the sea. And now across you. You will have to go to other places too. Mount Olympus, of course. Libya, as the Egyptians, and later the Greeks, will call it, an island called Seriphos. Perhaps this seems like too much of a journey. But this place where you find yourself means you are already at the edge of the world. So you will have to find your way back, not far from the home of the Hesperides. Though they will not help you. I mean, not when you find them. Which you usually shouldn't. That is, if you have to find the Gorgon sisters. That is, if you have to find Medusa. Métis has changed. If you had seen her before she realized the danger, you would have seen a tall woman, with long, slender limbs, with thick, dark hair, braided into a tail down her back. Her eyes were large, her mind quick. There was a sharpness in the way she looked at everything at once. Even when she was still, she was wary, and she had her own defenses. As what goddess does not? But Métis was more prepared than most, though she had no arrows. Like Artemis, or an almost uncontainable rage, like Hera, to use as weapons. And so, when she sensed, rather than saw, that she was in danger, she turned into an eagle and flew high. The gentle south wind ruffled the feathers on her golden wings. But even with her sharp eyes, she could not see what had made the short hairs at the base of her dark braid stand on end when she was in human form. She circled in the air, but nothing appeared before her. And finally, she landed on a cypress tree, craning her muscular neck in all directions. Just to be sure, she perched there, thinking. She flew from the high branches down to the sand. Her talons scraped small furrows in the earth, And then she was no longer an eagle. Her hooked beak retracted, and her feathered legs disappeared beneath her, as her muscular body transformed into another. Only the sharpness in her narrow eyes remained unchanged. Now she slithered over the brown-streaked rocks, folding and unfolding along the scales on her back. Her belly was the color of white sand. She moved across the ground as quickly as she had flown through the sky. And when she stopped, beneath a large prickly pear cactus, she pressed herself to the earth, trying to feel the source of the unease that she had not recognized when she was an eagle. But even the mice that lived on scraps in the nearby temple fled from her. She could not feel the footsteps of the creature she was running from. She wondered what she should do next. She lay beneath the prickly pear for a long time, enjoying the warmth of the earth, letting her heavy-lidded eyes wander. Though her body remained still, she was almost invisible. She knew it. She was faster than any other creature, and her bite was deadly. She had nothing to fear. But still, she did not feel safe. And she could not stay here, in snake form, forever. She pushed herself away from the prickly pear, moving into the shadow of a cypress tree. Suddenly, she stretched and transformed again. The ridges on her scales dissolved and became spots. The scales softened into a short pelt. 2 ears twitched, and clawed paws appeared at the ends of her muscular legs. A beautiful leopard, she swished her tail, scattering flies. At first, she walked slowly, feeling each stone beneath the pads of her feet. Once again, she felt the wave of alertness that she caused in the creatures around her. But once again, she could not shake off her own fear. She ran between the trees, the undergrowth snagging on her fur. As her speed increased, it did not slow her down at all. She could catch any prey she wanted. And what could catch her? Nothing. She reveled in her power. She felt almost weightless, a mass of pure muscle, chasing her prey. And then she was caught, pulled in all directions, and in none. She could not escape the bright cloud that enveloped her. She cowered, her cat's eyes unable to bear the light. She turned back into a snake as the cloud seemed to solidify and contract. She tried to slip beneath it, but there was no beneath. The cloud was everywhere, from the earth as well as from the sky. She tried to accelerate, to run away from it, but whichever way she went, it only became more impenetrable. The brightness was unbearable. It stung through the scales on her eyes. Her eyes ached. She tried to swallow. A last attempt at freedom. She changed shape, again and again. Eagle, but she could not fly. Boar, but she could not break through it. Locust, but she could not eat through it. Again, leopard, but she could not outrun it. The cloud began to solidify, and she felt herself being crushed. Her muscles began to ache from the pressure, and she had no choice but to make herself smaller and smaller. Shrew, mouse, weasel, but the pressure only increased. She tried one last time. And then she heard his hateful voice, telling her that she could not escape him. She knew what she had to do to make the pain stop. To endure another pain. Finally, broken, she gave in and turned back into her true form. As he raped her, she thought of becoming an eagle. The only good thing about Zeus's promiscuity, as his wife Hera often thought, was its extreme brevity. His lust, the pursuit, the satisfaction, were so fleeting that she could almost convince herself they had nothing to do with her. If only the act did not produce offspring, each one a new god or demigod, each one appearing for no other reason than to confirm to her that he barely distinguished between his affairs. Even she, a goddess with an almost endless capacity for resentment, could barely keep up with the number of women, goddesses, nymphs, and weeping children she had to terrorize. She did not often give much thought to Zeus's former wife. Métis was someone she preferred not to think about. But when she did think about her, she felt a flicker of unease. No one likes to be the one after, or the one after that, and Hera was no exception. Métis had been Zeus's wife for a long time before Hera had taken an interest in him. They had been together for so long that people had forgotten they had ever been married. On good days, Hera did not think about it. On bad days, she considered it adultery, the fact that any goddess had taken precedence over her. Hera, Zeus's wife, simply by virtue of arriving first, seemed particularly absurd. And because Hera had more bad days than good ones, she did not like Métis. But because there were so many other provocations to deal with, she usually ignored it. Métis, of course, was the one who had advised Zeus in his war against the Titans. Métis was also the one who had helped Zeus in his battle with Cronus. His father, Métis, who was so cunning and clever, was always plotting. Hera was clever too, as clever as the one before her. She had no doubt of it. But circumstances forced her to use her schemes against Zeus. While Métis offered her intelligence to him as a gift, Hera sneered. What good had it done her? Hera had replaced her. Who thought of Métis and Zeus anymore? Who questioned Hera's preeminence? The sister and wife, the queen of Mount Olympus? No mortal, or immortal, dared, and that made her angrier than ever. When Zeus and his former wife betrayed her, the rumors flew between the gods and goddesses like a whirlwind. No one dared to speak to Hera about it. But she knew, with each new piece of information revealed, she hated her husband more, and she was determined to have her revenge. Zeus had been silent for several days, no doubt hoping that if he stayed away from his wife for long enough, she might forget her fury. When she heard that he had returned, Hera settled into a large, comfortable chair in her bedroom, deep within the echoing palaces of Olympus, and idly examined her fingernails. She rearranged her dress to reveal more of her ankles, and pulled it a little lower in the front. "My husband," she said, as Zeus entered the room. There was a hint of a sneer on his noble brow. "My dear," he said. Over time, Zeus had learned that it was better to stop halfway through a sentence than to lie to his wife. Her ability to see through his deceptions was one of her less endearing qualities. "I know where you've been," she said. "Everyone's talking about it." Zeus nodded. "Of course they are. No one gossips like the gods of Olympus." He wished he had a reason to silence them all, or at least, the ones he had created. He wondered, briefly, if he could do it. Hera felt that she did not have his full attention. "And I was worried," she repeated. Worried? He knew there was a trap here. But sometimes it was easier to walk straight into it. "For your future, my love," she purred, shifting in her chair in a way that was not entirely innocent, so that her dress opened a little more. Zeus tried to assess the situation. His wife was often angry, and sometimes seductive, but he could not recall a time when she had been both at once. He moved a little closer. In case that was the right thing to do. My future? He asked, reaching out to playfully twist a lock of her curly hair. She raised her head to look at him. Yes, she said, I've heard some truly terrible things about Métis' children. She felt him stiffen before his fingers reached her hair. He was trying very hard to be casual. Métis, he said. This time, he could not stop the sharpness in his voice. And Hera quickly closed her hand around the lock of hair he was playing with. She knew he would snatch it away from her scalp if she wasn't careful. I'm just wondering if you've really forgotten what she said about her children. Hera sighed, that she would bear a son who would overthrow you. Zeus said nothing, but he knew her taunts had hit their mark. How could he have been so foolish? He had overthrown his own father. With Métis' help, and his father had done the same before him. How could he forget what Métis had told him when they were still married? Perhaps you should hurry, Hera added. She said she would have a daughter who would surpass everyone but her father in wisdom. And after her, a son who would be king of gods and men. You can't take that risk. But she was talking to empty air. Her husband had disappeared for the second time. Zeus went to find Métis. She did not try to hide from him. She knew what was going to happen. And she knew she could not escape him. All she could do was hope that her daughter would survive. Had she known what would happen when she told her husband, so long ago, that she could bear him a daughter and a son who would be able to control his father. She knew Zeus's fears better than anyone. He would do anything to make sure their son was never born. She felt herself surrounded by a blinding light, trapped inside a lightning bolt. Once again, she felt the pressure to become smaller and smaller. Leopard, snake, locust, but this time there was no pain. Only the sudden darkness that enveloped her as Zeus grabbed her in his huge hand. And then the strange sensation of being inside a black cloud, followed by the lightning bolt. It was an endless darkness. Zeus had swallowed her. She realized that now, she and her daughter were inside the king of the gods, with no way out. And even as Métis understood and accepted this, she felt something inside her. Inside Zeus, resisting. Steno was not the eldest, for they did not think of time in that way. But she was the one who was less alarmed when she found the baby abandoned on the beach outside their cave. Euryale was both bewildered and terrified. Where had this child come from? What mortal would dare to come near the lair of the Gorgons to leave it there? Steno had no answer to her questions. For a moment, the two of them stared at the creature, wondering what to do. Can we eat it? Euryale asked. Steno considered it for a moment. Yes, she said, I think we can eat it. But it's so small. Her sister nodded glumly. You eat it, Steno said. I already have. She did not need to finish. Her sister had already seen the pile of animal bones beside them. The Gorgons were goddesses. They did not need to eat. But their sharp fangs, their powerful wings, their strong legs, were all designed for hunting. And if they hunted, they might as well eat the prey they killed. They looked at the baby. It lay on its back on the sand, its head resting on a clump of grass. Steno did not need her sister to tell her. It looked like a very unsatisfying meal. And it was not running away. It was not even trying to hide in the grass that was taller than it was. Where did it come from? Euryale asked again. She craned her huge head, her bulging eyes searching the cliffs above them. There was no sign of anyone. It must have come from the sea. Steno replied, "Mortals cannot find their way here without the help of a god. And even if they could, they would not dare to come here. The child had been brought to them from the sea." Euryale nodded, flapping her wings. She scanned the sea in all directions. There were no ships, nothing that could have escaped their sight in the time it had taken them to find the child. They had heard a noise, a sound that had woken them, and they had come out of their cave together. No ship, no swimmer, could have become invisible to them so quickly. "I don't know," Steno said, listening to her sister's thoughts, but looking at the baby. And now Euryale noticed the damp circle beneath the child, and the strands of seaweed that stretched back to the water's edge. They sat in silence, thinking, it couldn't have been him. Could it? Euryale glanced at her sister, not wanting to feel foolish. Steno shrugged her broad shoulders. The light breeze ruffled her wings. "I don't know who else could have done it," she said. "It must have been Perseus." Euryale's bulging eyes widened. "Why would father do that?" she asked. "Where did he find a mortal child? From a ship?" The Gorgons knew little about their father. He was an ancient sea god. He lived deep beneath the ocean with their mother, Ceto. They had many children besides Euryale and Steno. Scylla, a nymph with 6 dog heads and 6 vicious mouths, lived in a cave high above the sea, from which she would emerge to devour passing sailors. Echidna, proud and half nymph, half snake. The Grey-Eye, 3 sisters who shared 1 eye and 1 tooth, lived in a cave somewhere that even the Gorgons hesitated to approach. Steno and her sister looked at the child. The sea whispered behind them. The child had been left some distance from the waves. Steno pointed to the trail that led to it. There were indentations in pairs on either side. Euryale nodded. "It was him," she said. "Those are his footprints." As they got closer, Steno noticed that the child was asleep on a pile of withered seaweed. Had their father gathered it to make some kind of bed? Everything she saw, and everything she thought she knew, was at odds with each other. The idea of Perseus, a god, doing something as mundane as making a cradle for a mortal child, was absurd. But there were his claw prints on either side of the wide path marked by his fishtail. And there was the child, safe, far from the water, asleep on a pile of dead seaweed, as thick and leathery as the skin that snakes shed. She thought about it until they stood right beside the child, and Euryale was examining it like an unwelcome guest, and a meager meal. It was then that the 2 sisters understood that Perseus had brought it to them for a reason. The baby. Euryale squatted down, tilting her head to get a better look at the child's shoulder. They had only seen its back through the pile of seaweed. But her sister was right. The child had wings. It took them the best part of a day to accept that they had a new sister. A mortal child. It took them many more days to learn how not to accidentally kill it. "Why does it cry so much?" Euryale asked her sister, poking the child gently. Her claws were carefully retracted into her palm so that she would not hurt it. Steno watched her sister anxiously. "I don't know," she said. "Who knows why mortals do one thing or another?" They both tried to think of any mortals they might have seen doing anything similar. But neither of them could remember any. In fact, they could not remember ever seeing a human child before. But then Euryale remembered a nest of ravens on the cliffs nearby. The ravens had chicks, she told Steno, who nodded as if she remembered. The chicks make the most awful noise, Euryale said, and the mother brings them food. Her wide mouth spread into a grin. She flew a short distance inland, until she reached the nearest settlement. She returned with a sheep under each arm. They give the child milk, she said, and so, though they were goddesses, they learned how to feed their little sister. Sometime later, Steno realized that she could not remember what their home had looked like before there were small, curly-horned sheep scrambling over the rocks. Even Euryale, who used to soar through the sky looking for prey to snatch up in her great jaws and crunch its bones for the sheer pleasure of the sound, seemed to enjoy watching them. One day, an eagle tried to steal one of the sheep, and Euryale took to the air to save it. The eagle was too quick for her, and she returned empty-handed, a few of her feathers drifting down to the sand behind her. But the eagle did not try again. In those early days, Steno wondered if Perseus would return to explain his actions, or bring a message from their mother, Ceto, but he never came. The Gorgons had different feelings about this. Euryale was proud that their parents had entrusted this strange mortal child to their care. Steno wondered if her father had left the child with them in the hope that they would fail. Gods could not look at mortals without feeling a certain amount of disgust. Steno loved her new sister as much as she loved Euryale, but she still had to suppress a shudder when she saw her tiny hands and feet. Her horrible little nails. But even if there was something wrong with her, Medusa was a Gorgon too, and perhaps she would improve with age.